What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here with a new daily video. All of the stories therein are new to this channel as well as I can keep track of. So if you guys end up enjoying this video and you guys are enjoying these daily videos, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. It really helps the video to do well and ensures I can keep making these videos daily for a long time to come. If you guys have any thoughts you'd like to share in the comments, either about the stories or the video itself, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts about doing this is reading your guys' comments, even if I may not always be able to respond to them. Either way, I'm gonna let you guys enjoy the next hour or so of true scary stories, and I'll see you again at the end of the video. Thanks for watching. So when I was probably in 2nd or 3rd grade, we had an early dismissal. For those of you who don't know, that's when school goes on for longer than half a day, but we still get out an hour or so early. I remember sitting silently in class, working on some math problems, when the phone rang. I joked to my friend next to me that I hoped it was for me. We all watched the teacher answer the phone, because we knew that 90% of the time it meant someone was leaving class. When the teacher's eyes met with mine, suddenly I got pretty worried. I was an anxious kid, so immediately I thought someone must have died. My teacher said something into the phone, and then asked me, "When are you getting off the bus today?" I thought this was a pretty weird question. My mom already knew when I would be getting home, because she had to leave work early so she'd be there when I got there. I told my teacher the normal time. My teacher spoke for a few more seconds, then hung up the phone. I asked her what that was all about, and she told me my parent just wanted to double-check what time I got off. I didn't really think too much about it for the rest of the day. Later on, when I got off the bus, I walked home without much incident. When I walked to the front door, my mom asked me about my day and took my coat. I remember the exact look on her face when I asked her, "Why did you call the school to see what time I was getting off the bus?" She looked shocked. She said she hadn't called the school. I told her the whole story, and immediately she started making frantic phone calls. I knew right away something was wrong. I sat down and watched some TV while my mom talked up a storm. About 20 minutes later, my stepdad arrived home early from work. About 10 minutes after that, a state trooper pulled up as well. I was pretty scared at this point. I thought somehow I was going to be in trouble. The trooper asked me a few questions, such as, "Has anyone ever tried to talk to you while you've walked from the bus stop? Have you ever seen anyone parked there who didn't have a kid get into their car? Has anyone ever tried to give you a ride?" The answer to all these questions was no. I'd never seen anyone suspicious, as we lived in a pretty nice neighborhood and it was mostly old retired folk who lived around us. My mom asked me to go upstairs and pack a bag, as it was my dad's weekend for visitation. When my dad got there to pick me up, he was questioned pretty heavily by the trooper as well. I eavesdropped from upstairs. My mom called me back down and I left with my dad for the weekend. My dad taught me some basic self-defense, which I thought was pretty cool. I never heard anything else about the situation, and eventually I forgot about it. Fast forward to today. I've been listening to some creepy narrations on YouTube. When I suddenly remembered this whole incident, I asked my mom about it, and what she told me chilled me to my core. She told me that day, someone had called the school pretending to be my dad. This man knew my dad's full name, my full name, and all the details about my mother as well. He kept on saying my mother had told him to pick me up from the bus stop because she wasn't going to be able to leave work early. The school didn't even bother calling my mother. The only thing that saved me that day from being abducted was the fact I had told that man I'd be getting off the bus at the normal time, which was around 3:15. But because it was a shorter day, I actually got off the bus around 1:45. This was about 4 or 5 years ago, but it still gives me nightmares. I was at the time attending a college that was only about a 10-minute walk away from my Nana's apartment. In between classes, I would walk over to visit her because of this. This was in a fairly sketchy part of town. so I would dress fairly frumpy. Sweatpants, an oversized sweatshirt, and always keeping my hood up and covering my face. I figured if I wore nothing attractive or flashy and was as plain as possible, I'd give off the message of "don't bother me." My mistake was thinking that in the middle of the day, no one would try to do anything. I was not calling attention to myself, so I figured I'd be practically invisible. But boy, was that wrong. I was just leaving her house and heading back to campus when I noticed this plain blue van slowly driving right next to me. It was a man who seemed to be asking me directions to a well-known hotel that had giant signs posted all over the side of the road. I didn't answer him because of this, and instead kept my head down, walking a bit quicker away from his car. At that point, I saw him pull into the parking lot near us to turn his car off and hop out. Now he ran up to me, walking next to me. He said I was pretty and started asking me the usual questions. "What's your name? Know any places to party? Why are you being so shy? Don't you need a ride?" I don't know why I decided to do this. I probably thought if I acted like I was real tough, he would just leave me alone. I stopped walking, turned around and looked him in the face, and said, "Take a hint, you bastard. If I'm not answering you, it means leave me alone." The look he gave me in that moment sent chills down my spine. His eyes grew extremely wide, and he looked at me with this expressionless face. In a cold, emotionless tone, he said, "Okay, little girl, we'll see." He walked away, staring at me the whole time. I saw him jump in his car, only to fly out of the parking lot in the opposite direction. I felt a bit relieved, seeing as how I'd seen him drive away, and continued on my route. As I was crossing the road, though, the same van came screeching towards me. He drove up onto the sidewalk right in front of me, nearly running me over and blocking my path. "Get in the van now!" I was frozen in fear. I was terrified and in shock. I stood there, telling myself to run, but my legs felt like lead, and I couldn't move. He got out of the front seat and opened the back doors of the van, then repeated, "Get in the van, or else." Luckily for me, just in that moment, I heard a man's voice yell from the hotel right next to us. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" The creepy guy told the man to mind his own business. Another guy from across the street started to confront him as well. When he turned around to tell this man to shut up too, I booked it. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my entire life. Somehow I made it back to campus, crying and gasping for air, while people stared at me like I was a lunatic. I told campus security, who took down all the details and told me they would look into it, but I never got another update after. People, please be aware of your surroundings. Don't be like me and believe that just because it's daylight, nothing bad can happen to you. This night started off in the city, but ended deep in the woods. I just wanted to put that out there for some information. I'm going to obscure the locations for personal safety. I'm originally from the Northeast, but I couldn't stand the winters. I went south for college because of this. I was enrolled in my first year of university in the southern part of the US. The university was in a small city town, and going out to drink was the main thing everyone did. I was out with some other guy friends, playing pool at a small dive bar. An older guy walked up to us and started talking, asking if he could get in on a game. I'll refer to him as Brian. I was 22 at the time, and this guy looked quite a bit older, probably in his late 30s or so. We played a few games, and he commented about a bonfire party happening just outside of town. He mentioned there were some girls he worked with hosting it, and asked if we wanted to go with him. My friends declined, but I was single at the time, so I said, sure, why not? As we left the parking lot in his truck, he said we needed to swing by his apartment and grab some liqueur. This is when things got weird. I remember getting in the car, pulling out of the lot, and then pulling up to an apartment complex on the very outskirts of town. The bar was in the downtown area, and we were now far away on the outskirts. I wondered if I'd nodded off on the ride because I couldn't even remember the drive there. I started questioning myself when he said he would go inside, get the booze, take a shower, and change his clothes. He offered for me to come inside too. The inside was completely empty. No furniture, nothing hanging on the walls, just completely open empty rooms, almost like a model home. He didn't even comment on it though. I asked him if he had just moved in or something. He gave me a weird look, then walked back into the bathroom without saying anything else. I thought about just leaving in that moment when I heard him get into the shower. Something about this situation was really starting to creep me out. I was sizing him up in my head and thought I could at least take him if some weird shit went down. I remembered him mentioning the girls and the bonfire, so I decided to hang around and see where the night went. His shower stopped and he walked out wearing different clothes a few minutes later. He had 2 bottles of whiskey with him and looked at me. "Ready?" We jumped back in his truck and pulled out. I made a very conscious effort to stay very alert. We left the city limits and headed outside of town on a dark back road. We were still on a main road, but now we were very far away from town. The closest city I knew of was an hour away in the opposite direction. There were fewer and fewer houses as we drove along. The places I did see looked like decrepit old shacks that had been abandoned for years. I had lived here for a few months, but I had never been out this far. We drove for even longer. So far, in fact, that a few times I had to ask if he knew where he was going. We were in the middle of nowhere now. No houses at all, just thick woods on both sides of the road. I didn't see him reading any directions or maps or anything. I saw a small parking lot with a gas station and a turnoff. A lone streetlight lit that station. Only 2 pumps, and they looked ancient. A red neon sign that said 24 hours. We turned off onto this side street and kept on driving. This road was even worse than the main road we'd just been on. No lights at all. Very narrow. It twisted and turned, now snaking through the woods. No houses at all, but I would occasionally see a rotting old mailbox every once in a while. We came to the top of a hill where there was a driveway. I again asked if he knew where he was going, and he just chuckled to himself. I was now in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods, with a guy I realized I didn't know at all. Fear started to creep in. When we finally arrived at a destination, it was not a house. In fact, it looked like a garage or some sort of industrial building. No lighting inside or around it. No motion lights as we drove up. No cars or other people. "Where is the bonfire?" I made my tone as direct as possible. He indicated just backward through the woods. We drove past this decrepit building, around the back and towards the woods. As we got closer, I could see a very small path. So small the branches scraped along the truck's side. After what seemed like forever, the trail opened into a clearing. I could see a few other trucks and people now. Relief washed over me. I grew up in the city and wasn't used to shit like this, so I started to think that maybe I was just being uptight and needed to calm down a bit. It was past midnight now. We'd left the bar around 10, so it felt good to finally leave that car. I scanned the whole group but could only see a few girls. A couple of guys were building a fire and trying to get it going. There were about 25 to 30 people here. A guy who was introduced as Mike walked up to us to greet Brian, but he stared at me the whole time. He never once stopped staring at me. In fact, they were all staring at me. Brian said he needed to take the piss and walked off. Mike asked if I wanted a beer. He said to hang tight and walked away. He came back and handed me an open bottle. I said thanks and tried to initiate some small talk, but he simply turned around and walked away. I started to look around, and now I could see something was really off here. There was no music playing, no lights. Nobody was even talking to each other. The people at this party seemed diverse in age. I wondered how these people even knew each other. They were all just standing together, mumbling. Each time I approached a group of people, they would simply stop talking and turn to stare at me. It was extremely uncomfortable. I found myself standing alone, with everyone looking at me, just waiting for Brian to come back. I couldn't see him anywhere. I looked around for his truck too, but now I couldn't find that either. I had just about had enough of this weird shit and was now ready to go. I kept on scanning around, looking for his truck, but it wasn't there. I hadn't heard any vehicle start or go while I was walking around. I turned back towards the bonfire, now seeing everyone standing together, looking at me once more. All 30 people were now in one grouping, and they just stood there, completely silent, unmoving. They just stared at me. The bonfire glowed behind the group, making the moment feel surreal. As I stood there awkwardly, I started noticing their faces were changing. Their expressions rapidly changed from smiling to frowning, their eyes going wide and snarling at me. But once I focused on them, their faces immediately went back to blank and expressionless. Suddenly, they began to walk toward me at a deliberate pace. I turned around and ran. I ran up the path out of the clearing as fast as I could. My adrenaline was surging, and I kept running. I couldn't hear anyone coming up behind me or any vehicles now, but I knew I couldn't stop. I needed to put as much distance as possible between them and me. I started to panic as the trail broke off and went different ways. I didn't remember that from driving in, but I kept on running all the same. Finally, I saw that industrial building through the trees and felt a bit of relief. I stopped just before the edge of the trail. It was late fall, so it was quite brisk out, but now I was burning up. I was wearing flannel and jeans with boots. Not exactly great for running. I was sweating like a pig and really needed to catch my breath. The light from the bonfire was not visible anymore through the thick woods. As I crossed the lot and passed the industrial building toward the paved road, lights came on inside. A second wind of adrenaline took hold, and I ran towards the paved road and kept running. My feet felt like lead, and my legs were burning, but I ran as hard as I could. I finally got too tired and moved into the brush to hide and catch my breath. I couldn't see any headlights, so I went back to the side of the road and began jogging. I was on high alert, glancing all around me. When I finally reached the end of the road, which connected back to the main road and the gas station, I went inside that station. There was an old guy sat at the counter watching a small TV. He noticed I looked quite haggard and asked if I was all right. I told him I needed to use a phone. He laughed and asked where I'd come from. I told him I had been out at a party in the woods and just gotten ditched. He gave me a strange look and gestured toward the phone on the wall. I could see he had a gun on his hip and had probably thought I was a tweaker come to rob him or something. There was a phone book, so I called the taxi to come pick me up. An hour later, I was back in my dorm room and went to sleep. I never did see Brian again after. I drove by his apartment complex plenty of times, but never saw his truck parked there. I never saw it around town or back at the bar either. I remember because it was an off-white single-cab Chevy, late 80s model with a skull sticker on the back window and Roman numerals on the forehead. My curiosity got the better of me a few times, and I drove out toward that small gas station. I followed the road to where the shop was and found it. I drove out a couple of times, and each time there was no one there, and it looked completely abandoned. The building looked even shittier in the daytime. I left and drove back to town. I have no idea what to make of the events of that night. This is kind of an old story. It happened back in the late 1970s, as will be revealed by a few things that come up within. I just thought I should mention that so no one wonders why I didn't call on my cell phone or something like that. Back then, the closest thing most people had to a cell phone was on the wall of a building, and you had to feed quarters to it to even use it. When I was 16, I didn't really have a lot of friends. I spent a lot of my time walking around town in the surrounding area. There was an old train yard that I'd like to explore. It was especially nice in the fall when it would be cool outside. I'd throw on my jacket and just go out and explore and have fun. It was fall of 1978 that I had gotten up the courage to explore an old abandoned hospital just on the outskirts of town. It wasn't like a sanitarium or anything crazy like that, at least not to my knowledge. It was just an old hospital that closed down in the 60s sometime. It was fenced and gated off, of course, and they had plenty of no trespassing signs on it, but it wasn't really a challenge to get inside. The only thing that was a challenge was gathering up the nerve to go ahead and do it. I had no idea what the police would have done if they caught me. If anything, I finally convinced myself to do it when I told myself it made no sense the police would be hanging around there anyway. I mean, why would they? I got over the gate easily and snuck in. The first time, I actually didn't go into the hospital itself. I just kinda explored the grounds. Although I had overcome my nerves regarding entering the property, I hadn't overcome them in regards to breaking into the building itself. There was a big old fountain right up front, covered in moss and other green gunk. I tossed some rocks into it while waiting around. Making my way around the back, I discovered an old park area. There were various things like slides and swing sets left lying around. I tried to swing on one of the swings, fell and hurt my ass, of course. After poking around a little more, I left. About a week later, I came back. I decided I was going to try and find a way inside. It was boarded up pretty damn tight, and many of the windows had bars on them as well. I wasn't able to break in this initial time, so I just left again. The following week, though, I came back with some tools to aid me. I was determined to get into that hospital somehow. I was able to, after much effort and various cuts on my hands, to pry off some of the bars covering one of the windows. I then used a hammer to break it open and smash all the glass off. I was finally able to slide in. Being inside the hospital was a very creepy experience. It was, of course, very dark in many places, and I had to carry a flashlight around with me. The higher floors, which I also visited as well, were not as dark though. That part was actually pretty well lit. Because the floors and stairs were all still solid, I was able to find my way around quite easily and safely. I explored a lot of the old rooms. To my surprise, many of them still had old and really rusted, worn-out equipment. Nothing like needles or anything like that, but various wheelchairs, gurneys. I was pretty excited. At one point, I went ahead and tried to ride a wheelchair down a wheelchair ramp. It didn't work out so well. The wheel got caught on some debris and I was propelled forward and onto the floor of the ramp, scuffing myself up quite badly. It was while I was lying there on the ramp that I could have sworn that I heard someone laughing. It immediately sent a chill down my spine. Although I couldn't be sure, I figured it was better to get out as quickly as possible. I walked back to the room that had the window I had broken, feeling like I was being watched the entire time. I rushed out, constantly looking behind me. I almost expected someone to grab my leg from behind while I was going through the window, but nobody did. I made it off the grounds and swore to myself I would not go back there ever. As you can imagine, that promise didn't exactly last very long. I came back a scant 6 weeks later. My experience had done enough to scare me into not coming back for a while, but not permanently. I convinced myself I had just imagined the laughing, and I'd simply psyched myself out. I had been around most of the hospital that day after all, and had not seen any indication that someone else might have possibly been there. There was no way anyone could have gotten into the building anyway. It had taken me forever, and I didn't see any other exposed entrances or anything. I got back in through my regular window and began to explore other parts of the building. I had completely gotten over my apprehension at this point. It was when I walked into what I assumed to be an operating room, because there was an operating table there, that I got the chill of my life. Plastered all over the walls were hundreds of Polaroid pictures. The vast majority were people I'd never seen before, but on one of the opposite walls, there were at least 20 of me. I saw pictures of me out by the fountain, me tossing a rock into it, me on my ass when I fell off the swing. I saw a picture of me on the ramp when I'd fallen off the wheelchair. The pictures were not of great quality, obviously taken without flashes while hiding, but I could make out they were definitely of me. I've never before nor since been as freaked out as I was in that moment. I'll just admit it, I wasn't freaked out, I was scared shitless. I turned and surveyed the hallway. I made my way back to my entrance window. Every step was a nightmare. Walking by every door, I expected someone to grab me and pull me in. Every sound caused me to jump out of my skin, and by the time I made it to the exit, I can admit I was nearly in tears out of pure terror. The process of going out the window was terrible too. I had to keep looking behind me. I made it out and made it over the fence finally, and there came the scariest part. I just made it over the fence when I got a sudden feeling and looked back at the hospital. there was a person standing right next to the fountain, looking at me. He had a Polaroid camera in his hands, and he snapped my picture. Did I tell my parents? No, of course not. Did I call the police? What good would that have done? I was trespassing. As far as I know, the guy might have owned the place, or perhaps been the groundskeeper or something. I had no proof he was an intruder. I also would have had to admit to both my parents and the police that I had broken the law by trespassing and shattering a window. So, in my mind, I couldn't tell anybody. My only solace was there was no way this man could have known who I was, or where I lived. Afterwards, I never went back to that hospital, just to be safe. Now, this story doesn't have any surprise twists in it. It doesn't have any people who are secretly watching me or anything like that, but it was pretty damn terrifying all on its own. My brother happens to work in a morgue, you see. He would never bring it up in conversation and insisted there was nothing scary about working there. I always told people where he worked, and they'd get real excited, assuming he had some scary stories to tell, but everything he talked about was very mundane and always boring. He always insisted nothing scary ever happened in a morgue. One weekend, I decided to make something scary happen. I snuck into it, and no, other people are not supposed to go in there, but I still did. It wasn't even that difficult to do, honestly. I knew when my brother was working, and I knew when he was going to be out for lunch for at least an hour. You ever see those movies where people eat in morgues? Gross. I knew my bro never did that. My ingenious idea was to go into one of the cabinets and slide myself on top of one of the corpses and close it. Gross, right? I thought it would be fine because the corpse was covered in a very heavy apron of some sort. When it opened, I would scream at my brother and make him mess his pants. It would be worth it to be that close to a dead body for just a little while. It's not like they're that different from a live person, just very still. They don't have secret germs or cooties or anything like that. I won't lie, it wasn't easy to cram myself inside. There wasn't a whole lot of extra room, and closing myself in was difficult as hell. Pushing the platform back in and getting the cabinet door shut from the inside, almost impossible. Took me so long, I assumed my brother or someone else would make it back before I was done, but they didn't. I closed myself in and waited for the moment I was going to scare the hell out of my bro. I waited. I heard him come in and I prepared myself, but he didn't open the cabinet. I could hear him moving around, working, but he didn't open it. Actually, I didn't hear him open any cabinets. He was definitely moving around there, though. I figured a good joke was worth a little wait. Hell, I'd already been lying there for a little while. Was it gonna hurt me to lay there much longer? So I laid there and waited and waited. Must have been 2 hours or something in my mind at least. Then I suddenly felt something. The corpse I was laying on moved its arm. I didn't even care about my joke anymore. At that point, I began screaming and banging on the damn walls of the cabinet. It didn't take long before my brother opened it up, obviously very startled. I jumped out immediately and began brushing myself off. I don't know why I did that. It was like a reflex or something. My brother was both angry and confused. I kept yelling that the body was alive or something, and he wasn't understanding me. When I calmed down, I explained it better, and he laughed at me. He laughed at me when I was supposed to be the one playing a joke on him. He then explained to me that the smaller muscles of a dead body, although extremely rarely, can on occasion move by themselves. He told me I should feel very fortunate because in his entire career, he had only ever seen that happen one time. I'd experienced a once-in-a-lifetime thing. Yeah, why couldn't I have won pick 3 or something? That's a once-in-a-lifetime experience. No, I had to hide on a dead body and feel it move by itself. At least my brother finally had an interesting morgue story to tell now, though. He always tells the story about how his dumbass brother nearly crapped his pants laying on top of a corpse that just so happened to move. This is a story that happened when I was in the hospital about 15 years ago. Well, I wasn't in the hospital myself. I was at the hospital a lot though, visiting my boyfriend. Yes, I am gay and this is very important to the story. I'm sure it had a lot to do with what happened. My boyfriend at the time had been in a head-on collision. I'll never forget when I heard about it. My body went numb, and I even blacked out for a moment. Seeing him in the ICU in a coma was just so bizarre. It was almost like he wasn't even my boyfriend. Like whatever made him Jamie was just gone. I'm not even sure if I'm explaining it correctly. It was just so odd to see him like this. I was allowed to spend time with him in the ICU because I was his medical proxy. His family was severely homophobic, and we worried that something like this might happen. He knew his family would never let me in to see him, so he'd filled out the paperwork and our attorney filed it. It was established that I had full control over the situation. I, in fact, could even keep his family from seeing him if I wanted to. I'm not that kind of person though, so his family was free to visit as often as they wanted, as long as I was made aware of the situation. My control over the matter did not sit well with his mom, of course. Jamie and his mom had never gotten along anyway. She would raise hell with the doctors about how Jamie was her son, and I was just the slur boyfriend. Yes, she used the term. I was not a true member of the family. They had better get her consent, not mine. Update her first on everything. At first, this was barely an inconvenience. I was willing to put up with it. I thought Jamie would have liked his mom to be there. Eventually, though, the doctors told me that her fighting with them so much, in front of Jamie no less, was a huge distraction to them, and the stress was affecting Jamie negatively. I tried to talk to her, but there's no talking to that woman. I tried to be nice and let her know I wanted her to be able to see her son. He had signed me in as his medical proxy. I was legally in control of the situation, and that was not going to change no matter how much she complained. She needed to quit arguing with the doctors and let them do their job. Oh yeah? Well, why don't you just get AIDS and die, you stupid... Jamie's mom sneered at me and called me a slur. That was it. I had been patient. I had been nice way beyond the expectations of anyone who would have been in my situation. I had her removed immediately. It was terrible. She yelled and screamed and called me and the doctors all sorts of slurs. Carried on about how I was going to hell, converting her son and making him into a... She was removed by security, actually the police. 2 nights later, I was leaving the hospital, heading for the hotel I was staying at. All of a sudden, I noticed some guy who had been sitting on the couch in the waiting area almost all day get up to follow me. He was big and dressed all in camouflage. He walked out behind me and into the parking garage. I was worried it might be a friend of Jamie's mom. I was confident, though, he would at least not try to do anything to me in the hospital. There were cameras and police officers all around, after all. I made it to my car and got in. Didn't take long at all before a pickup truck pulled up behind me as I was leaving the garage. Not only was it sitting awfully high, but the truck had its high beams on too. Annoying as hell. I left the parking garage and turned left. The truck followed me. At first, I thought it was nothing to worry about. You had to turn left or right anyway, so it was a 50-50 chance. When I made it to a red light, I flipped on my turn signal. Immediately, the truck turned on the same signal. I tried to put it out of my head until the exact same thing happened the next light. And again, and again. I debated back and forth in my head whether this was just being made up or if this guy was really following me. I turned on my right signal when I was supposed to make a left turn. The truck turned on their signal as well. I turned left instead, though. The truck switched their signals and followed me. No doubt they were tailing me. I made a turn I didn't have to make, and they still turned with me. In fact, I went in a complete circle and they followed me the whole way. I was terrified. I didn't even live in this city. Jamie had been airlifted there, and that's why I was staying in a hotel. I didn't know anyone other than the people in the hospital. I also didn't know where the police station was. I had no idea what to do but to keep driving. It was very late, past midnight, so there were not a lot of places or parking lots I could pull into where I could get help. I mean, there were lots, but they were all empty. None of that mattered, though. When I was feeling most frantic, I came to another red light and stopped. The truck, instead of stopping, ran right into me. My car died immediately. I was startled and scared out of my mind. I'd been wearing my seatbelt, thankfully, and hadn't been injured. The pickup wasn't hurt as badly as my now stalled car. Thankfully for me, the fucker just drove off, though. I figure what happened is Jamie's mom must have had this guy ram into me in the hopes I would be hospitalized or something. Then she could control her son's medical situation. Maybe that's why the guy waited for me and followed me for so long, getting up the nerve to actually do it. Maybe he was going to attack me, but decided I wasn't going to get out of the car and figured ramming me was a good idea. Well, it wasn't for him. The man was caught. It was Jamie's mom's cousin, of course. He went to jail for a hit and run, as I couldn't prove it was premeditated. Yes, he had been following me, but I had no evidence. His mother swore up and down that she had nothing to do with it, but nobody believed her. Jamie cut her out of his life completely when he recovered. It's been 15 years and we haven't heard from her at all. It was Jamie's decision, not mine, and we're still happily together today. For context, this happened 20 years ago, just after Christmas. I had turned 6 about a month prior. My mom went out one day and left my then 16-year-old cousin to look after me and my 2 older siblings, a brother who was 8 and my sister who was 11. My cousin decided to take us out to the city, which was 10 minutes from where we lived. We took the bus and walked around the city in incredibly unsafe neighborhoods, with basically another child responsible for us. After a few hours, we got tired and decided to go home. The city had a central area for the buses, not like a bus station, but like a perfectly huge square field with some plants and flowers and bushes. In this square field, lining all 4 sides along the streets, were many bus stops and benches. Basically, you could catch several different buses from that area, going all over the county and city. Since it was just after Christmas, the bushes along the field were covered in Christmas lights still. As we waited for the bus to arrive, I began to wander away and admire the lights, my cousin seemingly none the wiser. At some point, I heard a man call out from behind me and say hello. I looked up from the bush, only to see the man standing above it smiling down at me. Thinking back on it once I got older, it was quite clear the man was homeless, and from the look of his eyes, possibly on drugs. He had longish brown hair that was extremely wet, teeth that were black along the gums, and his clothes were incredibly dirty and torn. He had several jackets on as well. None of this really registered in my 6-year-old brain though. I just smiled back up and said hello. The man asked if I liked looking at these lights. I said yes, they were very pretty. He said this, and I'll never forget this exact sentence. Well, if you like Christmas lights, I've got some really cool lights at my house that you'll love. You want to come see them? I eagerly said yes. He reached down and took my hand in his. We started to walk away together. We were headed to the corner of the field where a few bigger buildings were. He said his apartment was just a couple blocks away. We were headed around the corner of the building when my arm jerked backward suddenly. I turned to see my sister pulling me away from the man. He didn't say a single word in response. He just instantly took off running. It took a few years for me to fully grasp the danger I was in. My sister and brother talked about what happened a lot and how scary it was. When I finally got a little older, I appreciated how terrifying it really was and how close I was to having my life change or possibly end forever. If I had rounded that city corner with the man, they never would have been able to find me in time. They wouldn't have even known where to start looking before we disappeared around that corner and deep into the city. It's something we still bring up sometimes to this very day. I've wanted to post this story for years, and now I finally have a way to share it. This is going to be a long read, but I'll tell you about the scariest experience of my life. I was 15 years old, living in a medium-sized city in North Florida. About 60,000 people or so, but some areas were really spread out and rural. Don't think of it like New York City or anything. More like a lot of houses spread out over a huge area, with a condensed shopping center here and there. I was a bit of a punk that my parents had a hard time controlling, so that meant I basically snuck out constantly and was always riding my bike around the city all hours of the night with my friends, fighting and constantly causing trouble. For reference, I was probably about 5'10" and 150 pounds around this time. My next door neighbors were my best friends. Let's call them Nick and Tim. Nick was the younger, and probably 5'5" and 140 pounds. Tim was 5'8" and easily 210. They were brothers and only a year or so apart. On that night, Tim had texted me around 1 a.m., asking me to go ride with him and his brother to his girlfriend's house so he could try and get lucky. I remember being very hesitant because of how long the ride was. I looked it up and it was about 10 miles from my house to our street. But Tim begged and begged me to go until eventually I agreed. Our city had a curfew, meaning any police in the area that saw you and assumed you were a minor would stop you and possibly issue a ticket and bring you home. That meant we had to be careful about being seen by any cars going by. Well, the bike ride to her house went by without any issues. We took our time, joked around, smoked a little pot, and genuinely enjoyed the ride together. We ran out of what little pot we had on the way, and finally got to his girlfriend's house after what felt like an hour. Tim snuck around the back to go in, and Nick and I just sat near the electrical box and talked. Maybe 30 or so minutes went by, and Tim triumphantly snuck out of the house, bragging about his time in there. He said we should head back home now. Annoyed at how long we'd been waiting there, and nearly sober now, we both agreed. The first mile of the ride back went fairly smoothly, but soon after, things changed. We had just passed a decent-sized shopping area, which was obviously closed, and a church. We rode by slowly, in zero rush at all. After we passed, it led to a long stretch of road, with woods and canals on each side. 2 lanes on each side separated by palm trees and landscaping in the middle. We were riding on the right-hand sidewalk, when off in the distance we saw a very tall older man, wearing a yellow raincoat and a large backpack. He was just pacing back and forth on the sidewalk, under a street light on the corner of the parkway and side street. We all went silent as we got closer. I don't think he could see and hear us from that far away, as there were no lights over us and there were sprinklers going off in the median as well. I remember hearing him dragging his feet across the ground, clearly mumbling something to himself. He was dragging his feet almost like he was trying to brush away the concrete to find something underneath it. The mumbling was becoming more incoherent and frantic as we approached closer. Honestly, it made my stomach knot up and my heart sink in my chest. I couldn't understand anything he was saying, mind you. The only way to get home, though, was to go right by him. "Hey, why don't we cross the street and go another way?" Tim and I agreed. I remember this so distinctly. As we crossed the landscaped medium, a jet of sprinkler water hit me directly in the face and got in my mouth and eyes. It smelled horribly. We could now hear the mumbling and scraping of his feet much clearer. I could make out more details about him as well. He was smoking a cigarette, probably 6'5" or so. He had this huge backpack on and was extremely skinny, really long gray hair, wearing combat boots and ripped jeans. He had a full white beard, almost kind of like Gandalf or something. He didn't seem to notice us until we were directly across from him. We all had our eyes locked in his direction when he suddenly stopped moving altogether. He stopped talking, stopped scraping his feet. All of a sudden, he just looked up from the ground and let out this god-awful screech. It was like he was screaming 100 words at once. None of us knew what he was trying to say, obviously. After the initial scream, though, I could make out one thing. "What the fuck are you doing?" It startled us. We were now only 25 yards away from him. When he turned to look at us, it was obvious he was addressing us. "What the fuck are you looking at?" I was a foolish teenager. I piped up trying to say something smart when Tim grabbed my mouth and said, "Don't say a fucking word." I didn't. I kept quiet. In hindsight, I'm glad I kept quiet. The man kept screaming in our direction as we rode past him. The further we rode, the fainter the screaming got, and then it stopped altogether. We crossed the street again to the other side and made it about a mile down the road, all of us now on edge. We kept glancing over our shoulders constantly to make sure the man was not following us or something. We talked briefly about it, how strange that was, but we were glad it was over with. Or so we thought. Nick and Tim were riding in front of me, when suddenly I thought I could hear something from behind me. I turned around, and there he was only an arm's length away, rushing directly for me. The yellow raincoat was pulled up over his head and buttoned to hide his face. The man was standing up on his mountain bike, pedaling insanely fast. We locked eyes, and he just started screaming, and I mean fully screaming. Not even words, not any language, just a constant howling scream, as loud as he could. I get the chills even writing this down now. If someone ever illustrated an image of that moment and I saw it, I'd have a panic attack immediately. I screamed to everyone else, "He's right behind us!" We started pedaling as hard as we could. He was right behind us the whole time though, still screaming. Every so often he would catch right up to us, screaming and trying to knock us off our bikes with an attack. I don't know how long we rode with him chasing us, but it felt like an eternity. I think age played a huge factor in the end though, because he eventually got tired and we started to ease ahead a bit. Exhausted, we pulled into a random neighborhood and started cutting through yards trying to lose him. We jumped off our bikes and all just decided that if he was still chasing us, we were going to make a stand together and fight him. It was like a hive mind decision. We were all too tired to keep going, so this was our only option. We waited and waited for him to come to us, but he didn't come. I don't even remember hearing him anymore. I guess somehow we'd lost him. I called my house phone, waking both my parents up in the process, and told my dad about the situation. He told me to get home and figure it out myself. I asked to talk to my mother, and she yelled at me on the phone and refused to pick us up as I stood there in the middle of the street, hoping this crackhead didn't come back and kill us all. I got home with Nick and Tim in tow, who asked if they could crash in my room. Of course, I said yes. I think we all have some weird feelings about that night, and we never really spoke of it again. I don't know what he wanted, and clearly he was on drugs, but it makes me wonder, would he have robbed us or done something worse if he got up to us? I was driving home from house sitting in another city. It usually takes me about 6 hours to do this drive on my motorcycle because I have to pull over regularly to massage feeling back into my butt and stretch my legs a bit. I left around 11:30 a.m. and happened to miss a weather alert with thunderstorm warnings along my route. This road takes me through mountain passes with a lot of hairpin turns. The normal speed is 80 kilometers per hour, and a couple of these turns have posted speeds going as low as 30. It started hailing and pouring rain, full-on thunderstorm weather. I was doing my best to keep the speed limit while also being safe. There was nowhere to pull over and just wait it out, not many passing lanes in the mountains. On the last hairpin turn, I slowed down to take it at the posted speed, when this huge truck, who'd been behind me for about 15 minutes, pulled into the oncoming lane, illegally mind you. They sped up next to me, laying on the horn thick. It was a blind corner. He saw oncoming traffic coming right at him. Instead of doing the smart thing and slowing down to get back behind me, he decided to gun it. If I hadn't downshifted immediately when I realized he was going to do this, he would have nailed me with the 30-foot trailer he was dragging behind him, sending me flying off the cliff next to us. The next town was about 20 minutes away. I pulled into a gas station to dry out a little and calm down after what just happened. I watched the man calmly drive away like nothing ever occurred. About 2 hours later, I pulled into a fruit stand to grab a snack and take a well-deserved break. This was now 3 towns further down the highway, mind you. Lo and behold, somehow that exact same guy was there. He saw my motorcycle and pulled in to have a go at me. He screamed at me that he was about to teach me a lesson for slowing down on the highway to the posted speed limits for safe turns, mind you. When I asked him what he would have done if he'd killed me, he told me it would have been my own fault, and he would have laughed as I went flying over the cliff. We got into a scuffle, but that was about it. I really hope I don't ever run into that guy on the road again. What a crazy asshole. About 3 years ago, I, 21 and female, was a waitress during the height of COVID. It was my first ever job, and I remember being excited to start as soon as possible. After all my training was finished and I got my certifications, I was put on the closing shift. We closed at 10 p.m. every night at the same time. Typically, it was just the cook, 20s and male, and I. Rarely would there be another waitress with me, and I sorta liked it that way. I always worked better alone, and didn't really get along with most of the other waitresses anyway, so it was quite nice and peaceful. I can remember it was near the end of my time there that this experience happened, and I'm really happy I had the circumstances I did at the time. I never was one to really trust my gut very much. I have mild anxiety, and I couldn't tell if what I felt half the time was valid or not. I mention this because when this all went down, it felt real, and I had an absolute feeling. I had started my shift that evening around 3 p.m. or so. I said goodbye to the last waitress sometime later, and I was on my own with my cook now. Everything was pretty slow and normal, until I got a call about one of the specialty items on the limited time menu we had. The food couldn't be ordered as takeout, and the lady over the phone really didn't take that well. After a bit of debating, she decided to finally sit in and eat instead. I'd say around 10 minutes later is when I spotted an older-looking car pull up and 3 people climb out. 2 men and a woman who looked to be in their 30s to 40s. I could tell it was the very same lady I'd spoken to over the phone, judging by her attitude coming in. I further confirmed it by asking, since I already had a pretty good idea of what she wanted to eat. What I thought was an act of mild embarrassment and pettiness turned out to be something much more sinister later on. Her attitude toward me changed immediately once she saw me. She was much nicer and more cooperative. This didn't ring any bells at first, because it was something that most people who wanted to look good in front of others would do. I sat them down at a booth and took all their orders. I noticed they had this red binder and a black pen as well. I then went to tend to the other customers, as there were a couple of other tables I was waiting on too. Once I brought their food out to them, they asked me if I knew any realtors. I found this to be pretty normal, as this was a tourist vacation state. It wasn't uncommon for outsiders to be looking for getaway homes here. I would say this was a pretty reasonable assumption, as they didn't look like the unsavory type of people, if you get what I mean. Nonetheless, I gave them the phone number to a realtor I knew closely, and well, since I often went to church with her, there wasn't really any other notable interactions with them. There was some occasional small talk if I wasn't doing anything or if I was refilling their drinks or something. It was around 4:30 now, and they were the last of my tables to leave the restaurant. If any of you work in the food industry, you know that as a server, you don't really get breaks. Just lunch most of the time. Sometimes not even that if it's super busy all day. My cook and I took this as an opportunity for a well-deserved break then. We walked out behind them and had a small chat. I should mention by now that the front of the restaurant had a disabled ramp coming up the doors. It was long because the building was on a raised foundation. I didn't really notice it at the time, but one of the men took my cook to the other side of the ramp down near the end and started chatting with him over a cigarette. I was behind the railing at the top of the platform where the ramp plateaued. The other man and the woman were on the other side of the railing, about 5 feet below in front of me. We were talking about some random thing, and they started to ask some personal questions, such as if I lived in the area, if I smoked weed, how old I was. I hadn't quite learned yet that telling strangers such things wasn't a good idea. However, for some reason to me, this was starting to raise some red flags. I gave some very vague answers to all her questions best I could. They still persisted in trying to have some sort of communication with me outside my work though, no matter if I said no or not. I suppose they finally realized I wasn't going to give any more personal information up. So, the woman finally got to her point. She told me that she had some business to offer me, a cleaning service. I don't like cleaning anyway, so regardless, I would have said no. However, what she said next really solidified my answer. She proceeded to tell me she owned this maid service called the Pretty Kitties service. She said she needed pretty young girls like me, and she had 10 right now. She wanted to expand the business. She mentioned they got paid $30K but didn't specify the length of time and how it would be a really great opportunity for me to help her with her business. I instantly knew something was off here and that I was in danger. However, I didn't understand just how much danger I was in. I politely declined her offer and told her I liked my job as it was. I was very satisfied where I was working right now. She tried to further convince me by telling me how easy the work was and reiterating how much I'd make under her supervision. She mentioned something about the car for her business and told me to follow her to her car. She said she'd show me a picture of something. I knew for certain I was not going anywhere near her or near that car though. I declined yet again and said I was fine right where I was. I said she could show me on her phone whatever she needed to, but suddenly she was now hesitant. She proceeded to end the conversation immediately and bolted off with the two men. A little weirded out, I walked back into the restaurant with my cook and told him about what I'd just experienced. He joked about how I'd have good money if I went along with them. Because I didn't take the situation as seriously as I should have, I laughed with him. At the end of the night, when the cook's grandmother came to pick us up, I mentioned that weird interaction. A panicked look came over her and she sat silent, staring at me. I got confused and asked her if everything was okay. That's when I learned the signs of human trafficking. She broke it to me that I was almost trafficked, and I was incredibly lucky I didn't get kidnapped. My stomach dropped, and I panicked at the realization of just what was going on. Now, remember that red binder and black pen earlier? I went to work the next day and a customer walked in. Now, normally in my part of town, not many people like to sit and relax for a while. They're mostly there to just eat and leave, as it wasn't exactly a cafe. I went to get into my apron and sit this gentleman down. He was well dressed and alone. I sat him at a single booth and took his order of a single coffee. He had a red binder and black pen with him. I didn't even notice until my cook from the night before reminded me of it. I was shocked to see the exact same thing there. It unsettled me even more when he proceeded to just sit there for 3 hours, watching me the whole time. I kept asking him if he needed anything, but he didn't respond to me. I just sort of shrugged and went on with my business. Now, this might surprise some of you, but us servers, believe it or not, do listen in on some conversations. I'm lucky I did with this particular one. I remember him speaking over the phone about finances and how he needed to find another house. He spoke about moving money and how he was going to pay his girls that night. I ran to the back of the kitchen and told the cook. Thankfully, he came out with me to help deliver some plates in order to throw the guy off. He ended up leaving not long after my cook appeared, and I haven't seen or heard anything since. This happened a few years ago around mid-November. My mother and I love being outside and going for walks. This night in particular was freezing, but we decided we wanted to go out for a quick walk anyway. As we walked back home, we went down this one street that we used all the time. It was a neighborhood street that led back to the main street, then into our neighborhood. We got about halfway down the street when I heard a dog bark over the music on my phone. I turned it off and started looking around. I love dogs, and I wasn't aware there was a dog on this area of the street. For some context, I knew just about everyone in the neighborhood, and I knew which houses had dogs as well. Most of the people on the block had cats. This came from a house that didn't have a dog, let alone a big one. I happened to spin around to look and saw a dark mass just feet away from me. If they'd stepped 2 more feet, they would have been able to easily grab me. I felt a sudden surge of danger and started speed walking back to my mom, who at that point I didn't realize had stopped altogether. I turned off my phone and whispered to her that somebody was following us. She turned around and grabbed my arm. She told me there wasn't just one person. There were 2 men following us from different directions. We started to move through a zigzag pattern, and sure enough, they followed our every step. Once they caught on that we knew they were following us, one of the dudes called out and tried to start chit-chat with us. "Awfully late for you two to be out walking alone, huh?" I swear, his voice sounded like the definition of a siren's voice or something, the kind that lures sailors to their doom. He continued calling out to us. My mom kept walking and replying with quick replies. From the sound of his voice, though, I could tell we were in danger. I went to call 911. Instead, my mom told me to call my dad, as he would be able to get there quicker because we were almost home already. We got onto the busy street and looked behind us to see them catching up on us easily. We decided to risk it and ran into the middle of the street as cars passed on either side of us. We ran across again and met my dad on the other side. When we looked across the street, though, both men were already gone. We hopped into the car and searched the streets, but these guys had disappeared into what seemed like thin air. I asked my mom what would have happened if I hadn't heard that dog barking, and she asked me, "What dog?" I asked her how she hadn't heard that massive dog bark, especially with how good her hearing usually is, but she said there was nothing at all. I still have no clue what it was I heard in that moment, but I do know that sudden coincidence just happened to save my life. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.